luckily, I think I recognised most of the faces that I saw, all those little boxes, because anyone who knows me will probably realise that I am slightly out of my comfort zone doing a talk. I've never done a talk, never done a lecture, and I tend to try and keep my head below the parapet. Like to get involved in things, but I don't, not keen on public speaking. But when I thought the series of talks that have been done have been really interesting, and when I was asked to do it, I thought that it was a nice thing to do, and if I should set myself a lockdown challenge, this should be it, which is to get over myself basically and apply myself to the challenge of trying to do a talk. So I thought that it's quite difficult to know what to talk about. Most people don't know what they may know some of the things that I have been doing in recent years, but what I started working on when I finished my training. So I thought I'd actually just talk about huge range of things that architects can get involved with. And in my particular case, it's been working at very different scales across my career, starting with kind of mega structures in London and ending with much smaller domestic, often older buildings in and around Cambridge and East Anglia. So on the left, you've got a slide of what's now called Portcullis House. I called it, when I was working on it, the new parliamentary building, and that was right by Big Ben. And I started that in the late 80s. And on the right is something that was commissioned in lockdown. I mean, I was asked to work on it in lockdown, and it's called London House, and it's in Clyde next to the sea in Norfolk, and it's a listed building. And I just thought it's quite amusing that it was called London House, and it would make an arc of a talk from one to the other, and the scale of the work that I've worked on in my career, and also just how you apply the same set of skills to projects of really different sizes. So I'll start. I'll start by just talking about the first project. Well, maybe I'll start a bit further back, which is just saying, I don't know if anyone really wants to know, but to train as an architect, you do 3 years at university, or Polytechnic as it was back then, often applying with a portfolio of art. So your skills are generally on the artistic bent, but you need to be good at practical things, have a very good 3D brain, and be interested in 3D structures and solving problems really, but also interested in people and how they move through buildings, interested in cities, how they work, how spaces work. And we train for 3 years. We then do a year out in practice, come back and do another 2 years study, which is called a diploma, then do another year, and you do a final set of legal exams. So it's 7 years in total, and it's one of the professions, so you're supposedly a professional. But really, quite frankly, you leave college, even having studied for 5 years, with very few practical skills. You're taught to design, and you're taught about the kind of context of the work that you're doing, but you really don't know about the nuts and bolts of it. So when you turn up at an office to start working, you're very green, and you start working in a team, and you develop skills by other people having more experience alongside you, and you really basically problem solve from the very beginning, and that doesn't stop. I'm still trying to find new things out with new materials or new problems, even now, nearly 40 years later, 30 years later. So that's the kind of arc of the profession. And I thought I'd just start with this building, which wasn't the first thing I worked on, though. Before this, I worked on converting a coal mine pithead buildings in North Wales, but the next thing I worked on was this. And I worked for Michael Hopkins and Partners, who was quite a well-known kind of end of high-tech architecture. So he was with kind of Norman Foster and Richard Rogers, if they're names that you know, and he was the kind of third one of that gang. But he tended to do things which mixed quite expressive structures with more traditional materials. So he wasn't all steel and glass, even from the very early buildings that he did. He's quite famous for doing Glyndebourne Opera House and cricket stands at Lord's, for instance. I actually worked on a cricket stand at Lord's before doing this building, and lots of other things. And it's huge practice now. But this is what I started working on, and it is. Can people see my cursor? Does that work?
Yes,
I don't know.
Yes, that works.
See that? Do I need to change the colour of it, or is it okay? Okay. So the site was this, which is right opposite Big Ben, which is here. This is the river. This is Westminster Bridge. This is Parliament Square, New Palace Yard. And when we were commissioned to do the project, it was right at the beginning of when the Jubilee line was being proposed, and it was being proposed that there might be a station at Westminster. But the site, as we found it, or as you know, when we started working on it, was actually a motley collection of 1930s and 19th century buildings, actually around an open cutting of a tube train, which, if I show where my cursor goes, it goes through this block just under the ground, which was the District and Circle line. And when you stopped and got out at Westminster, you looked up, you saw the sky. It was one of those District and Circle line cut and cover, very near the surface tubes. And we were given this site, and it was suddenly an opportunity for there to be a land swap where London Underground would need lots of space underground to create a Jubilee line station. And then they would give the air rights to the parliamentary estate so that they could put a lid over this open tube, which has been open for 100 years or more. And then they could develop the whole site and put a building on top of it. So it was a kind of massive opportunity to change a bit of London, but it was a very, very complex project. And the diagram on the right, which I'll keep kind of referring to because it just helps you understand how we stacked up a job which had so many different parts of the brief. But it's that diagram is like all the different layers pulled apart. So there's an office building at the top, which is called Portcullis House and has a big courtyard in the centre, which you can see here. There's two very kind of thin layers of the cake, which are the District and Circle line running through at high level, literally just skimming underground. Then there's what we call a big escalator box, which has now become quite an iconic space in London, which delivers people out to really deeply underground to tube lines, which are the Jubilee line stations. So if I move on, this is what it looked like when they demolished the ring of buildings. And actually they were keeping this curved line, which was just under the surface, running all the way through while they dug right underneath it. And when I was looking and researching photographs of online to do this talk, I came across this, which I kind of felt was, we weren't, it wasn't this dangerous, but it felt a bit like that you were kind of propping up things and digging below. And I think this is for real. This is digging the District and Circle line, which was a cut and cover line. And they kept the trams running over all of this. Anyway, it wasn't quite that bad, but we were digging, if you can see here, deep down underneath to get to two tube lines, which was the Jubilee line tunnels. And we had to meanwhile keep the District and Circle line running for years, 5 years or 6 years. I can't remember how long the build was. And that was a challenge. The other kind of strange thing about this station is that all the way through the Jubilee line extension, which was built, the Jubilee line platforms all went side by side all the way through South London. But in order to get past Big Ben, they swung them like this to get past Big Ben because they were so worried. Well, Big Ben was not very stable, and so they skimmed down Bridge Street and then turned them back again and carried on. So you can't feel it when you travel on it, but that's what the tube lines are doing. And that was all just to squeeze in that gap between Big Ben and this site. And in the end, they had to inject the ground with lots and lots of grout and concrete to keep Big Ben upright as they dug these things. So the first kind of challenge was creating a layer for the districts and circle line, which is very shallow, but would support a whole courtyard building above. And so the architecture for that was very kind of expressive and concrete, and didn't have lots of suspended ceilings or anything, because there just wasn't room. But, you know, we were trying to do everything in 3 or 4 meters, 2 layers in 3 or 4 meters, and keep the line running, and be able to build a building which wouldn't be above, you know, would have its courtyard at ground floor level. So we invented these kind of structural trees, and it took a lot of coordination with all the services and everything to make it all work without a load of suspended ceilings or things that you might see in normal tube stations. But generally the architecture is kind of quite expressive of its structure, which was what the practice was renowned for. This is the next kind of bit, which is a very dramatic space, which has become quite famous in London. I don't know if anybody's been there. A lot of it crops up in movies and, you know, music videos and things like that. And we called it the Escalator Box. And it transpired really because I went to a very early meeting with the London Underground commissioning architects, and they presented us with a diagram of spaghetti, basically, and said, we want, you know, all these inclined escalators and all these tunnels getting to, you know, having to connect in one-way systems to everything. And they had these incredible diagrams. And then we, as the architects for the building above, had to somehow find room to find support for the building above in a rational way. And we just said, we can't work with your spaghetti. It's just crazy. We can't find routes, you know, for a rational grid to support the outside of the building. And at that meeting, which was, you know, just a meeting of 2 or 3 people, but what we proposed, we said, well, can't we just bring all that spaghetti and pile all the functions that you need, all the different routes and the crossings into a structural box, and make in effect like a department store where you have a series of scissoring escalators, and you're in a space and you see people and you can light it and you can see people traveling down in different directions, and suddenly you actually create architecture rather than just the experience of traveling down a tube, down an escalator. So this became quite a big thing, but it's also very expressive of the diagram that we needed to make work to support the building above. And you can see here that this building above is one side of the courtyard, which is arched, has to find, you know, to put its weight or its load all the way down through these columns. And it's an exploded diagram, obviously they're at stretch, but you have to find a path for the weight all the way down, and those columns come down through this escalator box. And that's what you're looking at here, these big concrete columns that are going up. And then the short columns, which don't need to go up, are actually part of a strutting system which holds this box rigid and stops it collapsing from the pressure of the earth. And we had to deal with the fact that it had to be 4-hour fire resistant in case a tube train arrived on fire, and it wasn't long after the King's Cross fire, so that was obviously a very kind of emotive thing. We had to deal with bombs, you know, bomb risk. It was kind of still within the IRA time, and you're building a office block containing 210 MP offices, so there were huge technical and structural difficulties. But this, you end up with a kind of trying to get an integrated design where everything is very expressive of the needs and is the exciting, quite iconic place to travel through. And then this is down in the tube line, on the Jubilee line. And again, it's quite expressive of this structure, which is these cast iron tunnel rings that they use to create a line. And then up in the building above, this is the actual courtyard. There are select committee rooms overlooking the river, which I was involved in all the briefing for. I wasn't really involved in I was more involved in the tube line than the building above, just because when I started the project, there was just me on the project and the director in charge. And obviously it turned into a team of about 30 of us, and I got left somewhere in the middle with people coming in above and people coming below me. I was probably in my late 20s at the time. And I concentrated working on the tube station, and then later on did a lot of the briefing for the building above, but I didn't really get involved in the details. But just in simple terms, you can see these big stone arches here, which you're seeing on this diagram, and the big columns in the corners, and they're the columns that are going to go down through the tube station and through the escalator hall. And then this is a kind of winter garden with cafes and things, which I think apparently are very popular. And it's made with English oak, which is laminated and has cast steel balls as the node joints. So it's all faceted. But again, it's the kind of idea at the time was very kind of structurally expressive architecture. And I think, apparently it's quite popular. I think there are problems with some of it, but we had to build a building which had a 100-year design life, which normally if you're doing commercial offices or something, they get knocked down again in 40 years. But for the MPs, everything had to be very durable and, if possible, procured from England. So I don't know if I've explained it enough, but I just thought I'd give you the taste of a kind of building at a huge scale, which has to integrate so many different kind of needs and uses, and has to work technically on lots of different levels, and really becomes part of the city and how the city works, and has to keep different sets of people apart because of security reasons, all sorts of things. So that's working at a very large scale. I peeled off from that office after having two children. I'd kind of worked part-time in between the two girls, but I found that it's quite difficult in architecture to work on a large project in a large team part-time. You're needed all the time if you're going to be of any use. And I think architecture, I mean, it's a great career and I don't regret it at all. I think it's a very flexible career, and really this talk is a bit about how flexible it is and how you can work at different scales. But it's unlike, I always say it's very different from being a doctor or something, where if you're a GP, you might turn up on a Monday, Wednesday and Friday and see 15, 20 people a day. And it really didn't matter whether you worked on Tuesdays or Thursdays. Your experience of your work was very, episodic, and was to do with, short bursts of time with individuals, and that might be the case with a solicitor with small projects. But if you're working as an architect on major projects, it's really difficult to work part-time and not be there all the time and involved. So as I wanted to work part-time, I peeled off and worked for other people who tended to have, who happened to have working in London but had projects in Cambridge, and they were all friends. And these were some of the things that I worked on when the kids were little. And I don't know if you can recognise, this one on the left, we called it the St John's Triangle site, but this is All Saints Garden here. This is Trinity Street and Bridge Street, and this is what was called the Divinity School. And the reason that the project came about was because this is a 19th century building by Basil Champneys, the Divinity School, and it was purpose built for them, and it had a 100-year lease, and St John's College got the building back at the end of the 100-year lease, and assembled the whole site so that they could arrange to get all the leases and get all these buildings so that they could possibly create a new college court. And we were involved in the really kind of detailed work at looking at older buildings and trying to carve out a kind of a courtyard inside that used the buildings from the back while keeping shops and interesting frontages on the outside. So I was involved in that in all the early briefing and designs. Involved, this building over here is just off Brooklands Avenue, and it's an old house and stables that used to be part of the Botanic Gardens, but then Brooklands Avenue got driven between the two and it got detached from Botanic Gardens. And this was a new entrance and conversion for English heritage. And it was, you know, an exercise in connecting old buildings, but trying to be as minimal and as transparent as possible so that you don't kind of spoil the buildings. And then the one below is dealing with a completely different age of building. It was the 1950s chemistry labs, which had very old fume cupboards in, and we had to create new chimneys that were going to be so tall that they were going to be very obvious. And in the end, we decided to make them copper, and you know, people can see them on the skyline, and they're quite exciting, but they are relatively recent. And I think this page just shows that I kind of went down in scale, but I also started dealing with context and listed buildings and things on a much smaller scale, dovetailing things together, getting to understand buildings and how they work and the fabric of how they worked. And I did this for a while when my kids were little, but all through that, I'd also started working on private jobs. And probably about 20 odd years ago, I stopped working for other people and actually just exclusively worked for myself. I had enough work to maintain a practice and work for myself. So the next slide is just a screen snap from my website, just to show the kind of number and range of things that I've worked on for the last 20 odd years. And they're all domestic. I don't work for commercial outfits or operations. I enjoy working with clients and engaging with clients, and I find that interesting and rewarding, really. And I think, I mean, I find work, you know, I was working by myself, and I always thought that a commercial situation would probably need everything to be done. You know, they would lose money if I didn't get something ready on time. So I always kind of steered clear of that and kept to residential things. And I've enjoyed that. And I don't know how many jobs I've actually completed in that time, but I'm on job number 302. And I started on job number 100, which my daughter always laughed at, but I was told early on never to start at job number 1 because everyone would know you're a novice. So I started at 100 and I'm now on 302. So somewhere on the line, I've engaged with 202 buildings. Quite a lot of them have been built. Some are just planning permissions and things. Some, you know, disappear, but that's what I've been involved in. And I thought I'd just take you through 4 recent projects working with existing buildings, which is what I'm really doing most of the time. Occasionally I do new builds and annexes and things like that in studios. And I've started describing the projects, and they all had different ways that they were working with the old buildings, and they seem to begin with G, so I carried on like that. So the first one is in Stapleford, and it's an old Methodist chapel, and this is it finished, and that's the chapel there, and it's end on to the street, and it has a garden and kind of workshop at the end, and a very, very narrow kind of alleyway by the side of it. And the client came to me, in fact he's my eldest client and he's my boldest client. He'd been widowed and he wanted to, I don't know, empty out his house and kind of clean everything up and just really be a much more kind of bold and exciting, and didn't have little kids that he needed to worry about, and has been probably the boldest client I've had in terms of interiors and things. But the house, when I came across it, had been previously converted in the early 80s, I think. He'd bought it in the mid 80s and his family had grown up there. It'd been converted by a DIY builder, and it was, you know, the whole chapel had been just crammed with cellular rooms. So there was nothing left. There was no space that made you feel you were in a chapel. It was just a chapel shaped house, which was just jam packed. And actually, it was kind of so poorly done that it had 2 staircases going up the back of the house to the 2 different ends. Both were at slightly different levels. You couldn't get from one end to the other. So it was quite inconvenient to live in. You also entered the chapel at the front here by the road, and then had to wiggle your way through, you know, 4 rooms in a row to get to the back. So every room was kind of compromised by you kind of walking through it. So it wasn't anything to live in, and it didn't really overlook its garden either. So the work I did, these are kind of typical architectural drawings. I don't know whether people understand them. I don't know whether I'm rattling through or going too fast or too slow, but these are plans, and these are sections and elevations. And this is the porch, the old porch. What I did was cleared out the centre of the chapel, and you'll be able to see this in photographs in a minute. Cleared out rooms, took away partitions, took away floors, and created a big space that you could use that was double height and you felt had the proportions of the original chapel. I took away one of the staircases which had been here and replaced the staircase in so that you could come up onto a big wide landing, and you could, by adjusting the levels, you could come to a bedroom at this end and a bathroom, and a bedroom at this end and a bathroom, and then overlook the landing down, down into the space below. And I also added a kind of see-through porch, a kind of glazed porch on the front here, so that you came right into the centre and into the heart of the house, rather than through this porch, is what you did before, and have to weave your way through. Opened up the room at the end onto the garden, which has become his study, and he converted the old sitting room into a kitchen here. So if I move on, this is after about week 2. So often in my job, there's a huge amount of destruction before there's any creation, really. And there was just a lot of rubbish to pull away and put in skips. But this had been full of rooms with floors all the way across it and walls dividing it. And the old staircases had been where one of the staircases had been where that ladder is, and the other staircase had been here on the other side. So we start taking it away, and we start seeing the actual proportions of the original chapel, and here the proportions of the original windows, which we're going to open back up again to get the original height. And then this is some photographs of it. Well, this was nearly finished, not furnished, and this is, furnished by him. So you can just see coming in the door from the kind of glazed porch into a room which has volume and is double height and is the original proportions of the chapel. I've raised the windows back up to their original level and used kind of modern double glazed but metal windows, which would have been more traditional to the time that the chapel was built. I've used wide, beautiful Douglas fir from Denmark with a kind of white oil and soap finish. So it's quite a kind of luminous room. And then instead of timber, we've gone for more matte black painted steel staircases and handrails, which are quite Puritan, really. And that is a big landing that overlooks the double height space. So this is on the landing. He's got a library up here, and he can look down. This is a picture of the stair and the stair treads, and so everything's kind of detailed to be, carefully designed to all kind of slot together. But you saw the photographs before, what it was like when we tore it all apart, and then it will take 6 months to put it back to getting a result, because behind all this plasterboard and everything It's insulation and wires and plumbing and structure and steel work and everything. So there's an awful lot that goes in behind before you get a relatively serene final result. And the architect's job is, you know, working that all out, coordinating it all, sorting out what the client wants, trying to come up with a practical solution so that actually at the end it looks relatively simple, but the process is anything but simple. And then these last photographs, he had a kitchen made by a joiner in Edinburgh, which has concrete worktops, which again, I've never had, you know, they kind of all have been all the rage, but I've never had a family who wanted them because they're very unforgiving for little children. But he was very keen to have concrete worktops and black flamed oak hand-built units. And then the walls are all in a kind of wax Moroccan plaster called Tadalact, which again, I hadn't used before, but it was really lovely to work with. And upstairs in the bathrooms, all the showers are in wax plaster rather than tiled, and they're all in this kind of deep green colour. So it was all good fun to work on. Going on to the next project, this is in Reach, so it's, you know, quite close to home, and I've called it Growing because it was really starting with a small cottage here, which had these extensions. This is overlooking Reach Green, Fair Green, where the fair is. And it's called Fitzroy Farm, but it never really was a farm. It's the end of a terrace of late 18th century cottages, and then a collection of outbuildings that were tacked on and kind of became called a farm, but it's not an ancient farm. And this is the back of those outbuildings, and it was, you know, they were pretty ropey, leaking. The front range was of breeze blocks. Some of it was in clunch, which is old, but it was absolutely saturated, and we had to take it down. And this kind of 1970s bit in the middle. So it was pretty weird property, which looked onto quite a large garden facing south and up the hill. So it's a beautiful position, but quite a kind of strange property. And the client was lucky in that it had just recently had a permission to knock these barns down and build a long extension, which had been a bit contentious, but had got permission. But that had been for 3 little individual bed and breakfast units, like 3 little tiny cottages with dormer windows and individual front doors, and tiny rooms at the top that you could hardly stand up in when I actually analysed the drawings. So there was a precedent to knock this all down. And the client, who was going to self-build it or self-contract it, wanted to he lived in this white cottage. He wanted to knock this down and extend this into a kind of long barn-like house. Drawings up to show how I work and how on Google, and I use it to model and to push and pull around the design in the first instance. I never take it terribly far. I don't normally do the inside in a very sophisticated way, so I can't do walkthroughs. Mainly, I mean, I could, but it would take days to construct, and people do take days. And if you work in a big office, there would be, or you commission it out to specialist firms, or there'd be students in the office who are whiz at doing 3D modelling. But I'm a bit old in the tooth, and I learnt half of it from my son, who was a teenager and quicker at SketchUp than I was. But I do use it, and it helps me design in 3D, and you can rotate it and push and pull it around. And then I tend to sketch over it for planning permission. So I use it to kind of work out the forms and then kind of set it aside and actually sketch. But in simple terms, it was just to show you what tools I used, and the fact that this is the old cottage, and this, in effect, it's like a new barn, but it's high. It's just below the height of the ridge of the old cottage, just to show the difference. And the planners like to see something subservient. But it's very long. I can't remember how long it was, 18 meters long, something. And the ground slopes from the cottage this way. And so I use that gentle slope to and terrace the floor level inside. So it's in 3 steps. So the first bit, which joins onto the house, is actually a big double height space with oak trusses and a big fireplace and chimney. So it's quite a dramatic space. But then by the time you step down, you can introduce the first floor. And so there's a dining room and a bedroom above and a stair up and a kind of landing window, and then a master bedroom and a bathroom with a really quite dramatic glazed gable, which is above your head. So nobody can see into it, but you can see the sky when you're in the bath, and kitchen and utility room and everything. But the elevations to the green are very simple and barn-like, and they have punched hole windows. Particularly they're facing north. There's a privacy issue, so you don't want to let in a lot of light, but also it was to try and make it look quite barn-like. Whereas when you're facing your own garden over the south, the whole thing opens up. There's lots of oak windows and roof lights and stuff to open the whole thing out, and the roof kind of cascades down. So although it's 2 stories, it comes down to a kind of 1-story building and envelops the old cottage at the back there. So I'll kind of move on, and you can see these are the kind of drawings that I would do for the builder and for the tender. So they're not planning drawings, but they're technical drawings. And that show that this is a ground floor plan, and it shows the old cottage and a room at the back. So that was really all we kept. We put a glazed garden room here. This is the big sitting room, dining room, kitchen, kind of entrance at the end. And each time you go through one of these things, you step up into the next level and step up into the next level. And these are sections. So this is like kind of slicing a cake. And it shows the kind of information that I am providing for the builder and working out how it's being built with the structural engineer, how it's being held up, foundations, insulation, all sorts of things. And then I've just shown an extract down in this bottom right-hand corner of the detailed technical drawings that you home in, you zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. And this is of a oak door with a York stone sill, and it's the thresholds and the drips and the DPC and stuff. So you're really having to think as an architect from the bigger overall picture of what it looks like from the outside, how a person is going to move through it, how they're going to live in it, right down to the threshold seal, and will it leak, and will it keep the heat in, and all those things. So your concerns are quite broad, and then you're also, you're looking after the client at the beginning of the job, and then you're looking after the builder during the job, and then hopefully delivering a building that they enjoy living at the end of the job. So this is, photographs having demolished all those buildings and leaving the terrace at the front, and this other kind of rear back extension, 19th century back extension. The kind of mess that you uncover when you take things down with old bits of clunch. Clunch is a chalk stone that is quarried in Reach. So you often find, and we do have clunch in Great Wilbraham quite a lot. Foundations starting to go up in blockwork and steel, starting to put the roofs on, how it's looking from the green. It's beginning to take shape. And these photographs down here at the bottom are of the kind of traditional trades which still get involved in building. So this is a leadworker bossing the lead and with wood core rolls and making a kind of traditional top to a dormer window. And this is the carpenter working with green oak in a very traditional way. So green oak is undried oak. So it's softer to work with, but it tends to, it will shrink and split as it dries out. And then these are the trusses, which are wrapped in cling film when they're in position to stop them being damaged by the rain until the roof gets put on. And then some more kind of progress shots. This is looking up when that roof is on and it's all been plastered. These are upper bedrooms. This is the glazed room before the glass goes in. And again here, looking at the junction of the oak. This is detailed reclaimed brick, making kind of herringbone patterns at the end here, where you can see it just underneath that window. And you begin to see it taking shape. We've used oak windows everywhere, which were handmade in Everston, and it kind of begins to look like the barn that I wanted it to look like from the green side, whereas from the garden side, it's much more open and is going to have, you know, these doors open sideways, sliding, and you know, you can open the whole of the back of the house to the garden once the garden gets done. And then because he's self-built it, I haven't actually got any photographs of the inside, because he hadn't finished it off when I stopped needing to visit. And I think he has finished it off, but I think it's quite chaotic in there. So I haven't actually got any interior photographs, but I did manage to sneak by last weekend in the snow and take some photographs of it without scaffolding or netting or anything. And that's how it's looking at the moment, which I feel sits quite well in the village and will feel a kind of a appropriate addition to these houses, and it doesn't look incongruous. And then this is from the back. I think the garden is still pretty unkempt, but you see how the whole thing opens out. And we've used, you know, really good quality clay tiles, lead roofs, oak windows and stuff. And then here you can see the herringbone brickwork and the gable window for the fireplace. So it's not fireplace, sorry, bathroom. So the next project of the 4 is in Cambridge, and it's in Newnham Village, and it's on the corner of Grantchester Meadows and South Green Road. And it's really the point at which, if you're just coming here, you would park on the gravel to go and walk along Cam in the meadows. And it is a cottage that I checked up on the maps, and it was the first little cottage that existed down that way when the whole place was just fields and there was a little trackway to it. And then gradually the whole thing's been filled up with villas and houses, and the whole thing is, you know, quite densely populated. But it was this little cottage on its own, and it got known as the Wisteria Cottage because it's got this fantastic wisteria on the front of it. But actually, when I came along, a widow had lived there, and he'd let the trees grow up, and you couldn't see it. You only kind of peek your head through the gate and take this photograph. Otherwise, it's surrounded by trees. And when we took the trees down, it was kind of quite ugly at the back and quite a kind of mess at the side. And it was going to be a house that was, because of its plot, needed to be good looking from 2 sides, both from Grantchester Meadows and South Green Road, which is, it's on the corner. But this is how it was looking from South Green Road, and it had an Edwardian extension at the back, which was higher than the house at the front. It had a 1970s flat roof extension for his books, so it needed a bit of TLC. This time I've just shown you, I would have used SketchUp, but I've just shown you my own sketches, which I put in for planning, and then actually the finished photographs below, and you can see how closely they resemble each other. So things didn't change. I kind of built what I'd sketched. At the front, well, we put an extension on top of that little flat roof bit, which was set well back, and there's a couple of bathrooms in there, but that just softened that flat roof extension and put some new, everything's got new doors and everything, new doors and windows. But on the side, what I did was take down an old little extension, which was the same age as the front cottage, but built back up in reclaimed brickwork at a slightly higher, because really the old little bit was just too low to use. You couldn't kind of stand up properly. But by building up higher, I kind of obscured the bulk of that Edwardian extension. And so the whole thing kind of continues to look more cottagey as you come around the corner, but a bit neater. And then blended that into something that would look like a linear outbuilding, which in fact there was one just on the opposite side of the road, another linear outbuilding that belonged to a villa on the corner. So there were these two linear blocks talking to each other. So that this was meant to kind of look, you know, not necessarily house-like, but more like an outbuilding, and put a new entrance on the corner. So there's a vaulted dining room in here, and an integrated garage and a utility room and bedrooms up here. And this is, you can see it from the back. And again, these are drawings. I won't kind of dwell on them, but there's the existing stair and the front door from the front of the cottage and the two bays. I introduced a new entrance on the side, and they all connect up, and you can really easily use the house and come in the side entrance and use the kitchen, dining room, utility, and a private door through to the garage. And these are the existing rooms, and it works very well. And these are typical drawings showing the construction details. I'm not quite sure how long to spend on these, but I'm going to rattle through. This is it being built again, you know, devastation before you start building back up, ripping away old bits of buildings, saving the bricks, cleaning them, reusing them, piling because it's very dodgy ground by the river. I think they think that it was quarried by the Romans. So you've got very pitted gravel levels underneath all of this. So we had to pile because the foundations, you know, the ground was not stable. Putting in new steel beams to hold up the upper floors. This is the vaulted dining room with the underfloor heating gone down and before it's plastered. And then this is as it's finished. And then this is the old staircase connecting back through to the new back wing. And then this photograph on the top right is just to say that one of the little details was that when I looked at the old maps, I found that this cottage was called Brook Lodge, which nobody knew. And the client enjoyed that and had a stone carved for it and set it into the old brickwork and registered it with the post office. So now it's called Brook Lodge, which is nice, and it comes full circle. It's a nice feeling. And then the last project of the ones that I'm going to talk about is very recent, in that I was approached during lockdown to go and look at a house in Norfolk, which I thought was great because that meant that I could go for a walk with a good, pretend I was going off for a site visit and then grab a 2-hour walk and walk along the marshes, particularly when we weren't allowed to move around, and actually I was allowed to go because it was part of my job. But it's an existing client who has this holiday house, which is a listed building, and it's about 1700 or maybe late 1600s, and it's called London House. And I think it was a merchant house, and Cly, if any, well, quite a lot of people will have been there, but it's it's been silted up. But Cly was once a prosperous port serving the North Norfolk and East Coast port, and so there were merchant houses, and they're quite kind of grand houses in Cly, and the windmill, and there's an old quay which they just recently kind of excavated. So there are grand buildings, and they often, in terms of their kind of detail and architectural style, they're quite related to buildings on the other side of the North Sea. So buildings in Belgium and Holland, and this is called a Dutch gable. But they also use, you know, a lot of the buildings in Suffolk use pan tiles, which are also used in Holland and Belgium, and not really used further west than East Anglia. So we share a lot of kind of building language with the countries that we traded with, which I suppose is not surprising. But it's an old building, and some of it's faced in soft red brick, some of it's faced in flint work. So this is the side of it down this alley, and this is the back of it down one of these little, what they called lokes, which I didn't realise, but these little alleyways in Cly full of hollyhocks are called lokes. And this is the back of it as well. And this chimney is this chimney. And really it's a job I've called safeguarding. So it's it's about the judicious repair of an old building and doing the research and finding out why it's failing in certain respects. And I was approached because they got big damp problems, they got leaking roofs, they need a couple of new bathrooms, and it's a client that I've done a whole house up for in Cambridge, so he's come back to me. He had it done about 12 years ago with a local surveyor and a builder who went bust, and he admits now he spent too little on it, and the problems are a legacy of that lack of funds at the time. And part of the problem is I don't know if you can see my mouse, but that he built an extension here, a dining room, which he built on top of an old cellar, and I'll show you photographs, but this is what's causing the damp. So I thought I'd show you this, saying that I'm kind of tackling exactly the same issues as one was tackling in the very first project, which was a huge scale, which is kind of working things out in 3D and getting things to correlate. So this is the front room, and there's terrible damp all around the back of this fireplace. And if you look on the plan to the right, this is this fireplace. And the client has built a room over a cellar below, which is kind of, well, I've measured it to be here. The original surveyor had it further away. And what we discovered was that they'd paved over the only natural ventilation shaft to the cellar. So they completely sealed it. And it was absolutely dripping with water. And all that moisture is just, going through the soil and trying to find a way out. And it's finding its way out through the house and causing huge damp problems. But literally what I was doing, one of my visits this summer was spending time with a builder outside with a hammer on the paving slabs, and me and the other builder inside with a hammer on the inside, trying to kind of work out, who was where and where we could break through, and where we could connect. So whether you're dealing with a cellar in a listed building in Norfolk or a great big building in London, you're still trying to kind of make connections and work things out and, solve problems basically. So this is about looking after and safeguarding a listed building, and we will start working on it in 2 or 3 weeks. And so whether lockdown finishes or not, I get the chance to go to Norfolk for a walk, so I'm quite happy about that. Very quickly, I just thought I'd just put in a couple of slides of really what the other things are that are going on beyond the small world of domestic projects in Cambridge. And really, I think architects have a responsibility to try their hardest and think very carefully about the impact that they're having in the buildings that they're creating. Buildings account for nearly 40% of energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. That's both from heating and from the embodied carbon that is used in creating the materials and building it, and the transportation. So we have a huge challenge to get those figures down, and it's within ours, and well, there's a whole range of people who can help, whether it's the engineers, the material manufacturers, everything. Massive challenge, and it's what I want to be involved in, and you chip away at each project trying to make a difference, but it is quite difficult at a small scale. You can do little things, and I think you just have to face the fact that you will only be chipping away at a problem, and other people on bigger projects with bigger impacts can make a bigger difference. But what makes me happier is that this is now kind of mainstream, and it's not a marginal interest. It's become completely the central focus of what's going on, is how to reduce these levels. And actually clients themselves are interested, much more interested, in building green, reducing their carbon footprint, turning away from fossil fuels to electric heating of some form, whether it's heat pumps or solar power and things. So this is what I'm interested in. It's just one can't actually achieve that much with each little project, but you can try and keep it in your mind as you're doing it. And then I just thought I'd throw this in, which I don't think is for a discussion now, but we might have a roundtable discussion later. But I think that green issues are things that oops, I think that's the slide. I think there's things we could tackle and we could do, but I'll leave that for another day. So I think I'll stop there.